Hi, welcome to the video lecture for week 5 of our online Brit-Lit 2 class. This week we move on to the 20th century and after. So this is really my wheelhouse. I, as a scholar, work on contemporary literature, so late 20th century and 21st century. The Victorians are good, the Romantics are good, but this is really where my work is. So I'll start by saying, I think I mentioned this in an earlier sort of course overview video, but if I were teaching this class in an actual classroom during a regular semester, I would not teach the 20th century as one historical period. I would teach it as two. So I would teach the Modernist period, or the High Modernist period as it's sometimes called, and then I would teach Postmodernism and Postcolonialism. Incidentally, those will be our three big trends for the 20th century. I'll talk about those in a bit. The 20th century is really, for me, bifurcated. So what you get in the early decade and a half or so of the century is in many ways a continuity with the late Victorians. So Victoria dies in 1901. She's succeeded by her son, King Edward. He's succeeded by King George in, I think, 1910. And that's Edward VI, by the way, and George V. There are changes between the Victorian era and the Georgian era. The Edwardian era, and Edward is sort of a dashing playboy sportsman, he drinks a lot of champagne, he's a big dude, he's got an appetite, he likes the ladies, he likes art, culture, horse racing, dog racing, hunting, whatever it is. And so this period has this sort of vibrancy, and then under the Georgians people sort of sober up. So 1910 to 1914 is more sort of sober and staid. Still more sort of lively than the Victorians stereotypically were. But by and large, up through 1914, we have a sort of continuity of the Victorian period. But then in 1914, World War I begins, and this is a 4-year conflict that shatters the European psyche and shatters the European sense of self. And if you choose to pursue the World War I and its aftermath reading list, you'll get a much better sense of this. World War I erodes people's faith in Christianity, in religion, it erodes people's faith in Western civilization, it erodes people's faith in nationalism, empire, all of these things. And so you get into High Modernism. So you start with these movements during World War I, the Surrealists, the Dadaists, and people like this, who are coming up with these sort of new ways of producing art, building off of trends that we saw in the late Victorian era and the Edwardian era. It was really in the 1920s, in the post-war period, when you have what's called the lost generation. And this is true incidentally, for both British and American High Modernism, although America is sort of less disrupted by World War I than Europeans are. High Modernism is characterized by this sense of loss, this sense of rootlessness, a sense that the old pillars of stability, nation, church, science, technology, and things like this, empire, and things like this, all of the things that used to give people stability, those have been exploded by World War I. The brutality of the experience the insanity of the war and the horror of the war have shown that those things are all pretense. And this is a horrific thing for the modernists. So on the one hand, you have a trend that I think is best emphasized by T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and you'll get more of this in the specific video on The Wasteland, which is about trying to find bits and pieces of culture and sort of put them together and Frankenstein them in with one another so that you get some sort of viable culture, something that you can sort of stand up with and say, all right, I understand my place in the universe via these things. And I'll, again, pay attention to the Wasteland video, but the other sort of component of modernism is this sense that you pick up the philosophical strings of people like Nietzsche, who was a German philosopher in the late 1800s, and Nietzsche sort of invents the philosophy of nihilism, which is this sort of sense that nothing means anything, there's no sort of purpose to things. And you get different strands of this in the existentialists and the absurdists and things like this. So there's this coming to terms with the indifference of the universe to human endeavor. So whereas the Victorians had this sort of sense of standing at the apex of history and being at this great moment and achieving all of these glorious things, the modernists have this sense that they exist in a more or less indifferent universe. That the world does not, or the universe existence does not fundamentally care about humanity and about human achievements. The other big trend in this period, the other thing that becomes significantly influential, is psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud, whose works are starting to become known and starting to be read in Britain, develops his theories of dream analysis and unconscious drives, unconscious desires, and things like this. And this becomes really significant for English writers, British writers, who develop a style that we call stream of consciousness. And the idea here is that by simply writing the way that, or trying to write the way that thought works, trying to write as you think, rather than sort of carefully crafting language the way that, say, Victorian or Romantic poets did, by trying to put down every thought that goes through the mind, you're getting at something deep and unconscious and true. So this is in a way fundamentally a search for truth. The truth of the unconscious human mind, which is hidden in dreams, which is hidden in desires, which is hidden in drives, according to psychoanalysis. And so you get a lot of surrealist influence, because the surrealists are very interested in dreams and drives and the unconscious. And you get a lot of, again, stream of consciousness writing, which we get, we'll get, for instance, in Mrs. Dalloway, for those of you, again, who pursue that World War I and its aftermath reading list. By the time of World War II, so by the 1940s, things have sort of simmered down with high modernism, and World War II is its own sort of racking experience, but it's not as psychologically devastating as World War I, because World War I had already done that damage. So while the British are incredibly proud of their role that they played in World War II, justifiably in my mind, it's not a shattering role. But then in the 1950s and the 60s, things take a new turn. So in the 50s, you get this sort of emergent, angry youth culture. For instance, in theater, we have a group of writers, John Osborne being the key figure among them, who do what's called kitchen sink realism. And this is a very sort of gritty, angry, social protest kind of drama. So you get this turn to anger, you get this turn to rejecting the old order, the things that the modernists were mourning the loss of. In the 1950s, we start to get people purposefully rejecting them. And then in the 1960s, late 60s, and the 70s, we have the emergence of what's called postmodernism. And postmodernism is largely what I work on. Postmodernism is much more playful than modernism. Modernism, for as much as it enjoys irony, modernism is very serious, and it's very concerned about the place of the human in the universe, the negative components of meaninglessness, whereas for postmodernism, meaninglessness, purposelessness, rootlessness becomes the opportunity for playfulness. So, whereas irony was often bitter for the modernists, it's often playful for the postmodernists. So, probably the most famous definition of postmodernism comes from a guy named Jean-François Lyotard, who's a French theorist who in 1978 wrote a book called Postmodernism, or the postmodern condition, rather. And according to Lyotard, postmodernism is incredulity toward meta-narratives. And what this means, so meta-narratives are sort of overarching explanations of the world. Christianity is a meta-narrative because it attempts to construct a religious framework that explains the world. Capitalism is a meta-narrative because it constructs an economic framework explaining the world. So does communism, so it's also a meta-narrative. Politics attempts to construct a meta-narrative. Science constructs a meta-narrative. History constructs a meta-narrative. And so postmodernism is about destabilizing these attempts to construct what we might refer to as a big T truth. So it would be truth with a capital T, which would designate a truth that is meant to be universally true. Postmodernism instead posits that there are only small t truths. There are only lowercase t truths. And what they mean by this is that truth is based on one's subjective position. So I, as a middle-class, white, male, late 20s, academic, American, whatever, all of the identity categories that I have constructed my own view of truth. And there's no, if there is a universal truth, we don't necessarily have access to it from our subjective perspectives. This is the basic premise of postmodernism. And so postmodernism becomes about ironic play with signifiers, ironic play with signs, meanings, language, symbols, and things like this. And so we get a lot of sort of parody, we get a lot of ironic repetitions, we get a lot of sort of allusions to things like religion and science and nationalism that undermine those discourses, religious, scientific, nationalist, and so on and so on. And this is sort of the driving force of postmodernism, is that we can undermine these large T truths, these meta-narratives, in favor of constructing individual truths and sort of individual narratives. And this becomes the pathway to individual freedom, liberation, and stuff from the forces of oppression which are tied to tradition. The third big thing, so I'll just set it up like this because I fear that this video is going longer than I necessarily want it to. So the first of the three big trends that I want you to look for over the course of our readings is High Modernism. So again, that's this sort of existential terror about the loss of old pillars of civilization. The second is postmodernism, incredulity toward meta-narratives, ironic and playful attempts to sort of reconfigure the way that we see the world in less authoritarian ways. The third big trend of the 20th century and 21st century is postcolonialism, or sort of the emergence of the Commonwealth. Britain was the empire throughout the Victorian period. It retained its empire throughout, with the exception of Ireland, which gains the Republic of Ireland, or the Irish Free State as it was known at the time, gains its independence in 1922, and then like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the settler colonies become semi-independent dominions in the late 1800s or the 1900s, early 1900s. But Britain, by and large, retains its empire until after World War II, at which point things start to break apart at an increasing pace. So India gains its independence in 1947, and there's a partition between the nation of India and Pakistan, which is a new nation created in 1948. Then in the 50s you get national independence in Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Kenya, South Africa. You get, in the Caribbean, independence in Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and so on and so on. So all of these nations, or all of these colonies, emerge as their own nation states throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, into the 70s in some cases. And what happens after World War II, so the empire functionally is gone. Like, Britain maintains a few colonies, but by and large the empire is gone. So this is no longer a dimension of British identity, but it's been a dimension of British identity for over a century. So this is actually a really difficult transition. But then the other thing that happens that is difficult for people to wrap their minds around is there's an influx of immigrants from the Caribbean, from Africa, from India, and from Pakistan. So Britain had been historically white. The largest waves of immigration, I mean, other than like invasions in the medieval period, had been a lot of Irish emigrated into Britain, and you had occasionally sort of waves of French come in. So by and large, these were white immigrants. Now you have Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, you have Afro-Caribbeans, you have Indians, all of whom are coming into Britain. They're British citizens, they have a right to do this, and they come in looking for work. And so Britain develops a race problem, really in the 1950s, because, so I mean, the US, for instance, by contrast, has had a race problem basically since 1620, really even since 1607, because white European English settlers encountered American Indians, and then in 1620 the first African slaves arrived. Britain has not had a major non-white population up until the 1950s, and all of a sudden a bunch of people move from former colonies seeking economic opportunities in Britain. They encounter racism, and this is a newly emerged racism because it's dealing with new populations of immigrants. So Britain becomes a sort of problem. What am I trying to say? British identity becomes more complicated because of this new influx of people who don't look like traditional Anglo-Saxon English people, or even like Celtic people in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. So, but the other part of this is that postcolonialism and the expansion of ethnic minorities in Britain revitalizes British literature. So, some of the greatest writers of what we would now call the Anglophone world, and late 20th and 21st century British literature is an Anglophone world literature. People like Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Derek Walcott, Salman Rushdie, Adolf Fugard, Nadine Gordimer. Some of the greatest and most influential writers of the late 20th and 21st centuries are British educated, culturally tied to Britain to one degree or another, but they're either from former colonies, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, India, whatever it is, or they are of ethnic minorities who were born in Britain. And these people bring a major amount of creative energy to British literature because they explore this sort of liminal status, their outsider status, as both British and non-British, as people who are British citizens or who have British education and things like this, but who aren't accepted as British because they are from these former colonies or because they are sub-Saharan African, Afro-Caribbean, Arab, or Indian, whatever it is. So there's that dimension of it. There's this exploring of rootlessness and sense of displacement. The other component of this innovation is that they combine local traditions. So like Wole Soyinka, who is an amazing playwright from Nigeria, combines local traditions from the Yoruba tribe in Nigeria with British traditions, classical traditions, ancient Greek traditions, and so on and so on. And he produces these amazing plays that are combinations of different cultural influences. So that's the other trend that I want you guys to look for over the course of this reading. So again, the three things to look for are High Modernism, Postmodernism, and Postcolonialism.